Shalom, Kol Halor, Yahweh Bashim, Yahweh Shai, Bashim, Chakodash, the bars of the apostles of great millstone, and Shalom to brothers and highways and byways, doing the work sincerely and faithfully, and continually fighting the good fight of faith. Lord willing, we found that number to be delivered. All right. So it's going to be a quick lesson on, the things to come, mainly concerning, the North Country, which is Russia. And I believe a lot of people are sleeping on Russia because of all the things that have been going on, especially with the war in Ukraine. The propaganda machine has been pushing forward that Ukraine is on the verge of, doing some damage to certain areas of Russia and so on and so forth. But we know that not to be true. And we understand the military might and power that Russia has. All right. And so much so, even America don't really want to fuck with Russia. All right. So let me get a couple videos or some information, and break down a couple of scriptures, and just keeping everybody mindful, man. Keeping everybody mindful that at the end of the day, no matter what these skirmishes are, no matter what goes down, Russia is going to lead that charge. That's the bottom line, man. So don't think that Russia's out of the ball game, and what the propaganda machine has people thinking that they're running out of gas and their military isn't as strong as they thought it was. Trust me, that military is stronger than anybody could possibly believe. All right. So let me go here. This is Jeremiah 50:9. It says, "For lo, I will raise up and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the north country, and they shall set themselves in array against her. From thence she shall be taken. Their arrow shall be as of a mighty expert man. None shall return in vain." All right. So what's ultimately going to happen is Russia is going to assemble all these great nations. And they may be nations of no reputation right now, but once Russia starts deploying missiles and giving missiles and rockets and weaponry to these other countries, they're going to become a great nation right along with Russia to destroy Babylon. All right? And that's the deal, man. So this is Kiwi Post. This is explained. Who are Russia's allies? A list of countries supporting the Kremlin invasion of Ukraine. All right. Now, this isn't just extending over to Ukraine, because ultimately, the war that's going to end all wars is this Third World War that Russia's going to lead the charge. And Russia is already assembling these nations, man. It has been made crystal clear that these nations, that these nations that are in alliance with Russia are going to be, one of the some of the key factors in the destruction of Babylon. So some of those countries is Belarus, Moscow's loyal ally, and we're gonna get into a little bit about Belarus as well. Iran, North Korea, Syria, China, India, Malay, let me get my glasses on. This is Eritrea, all right, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and Myanmar. And those are just to name a few, man. Because ultimately, there's going to be many more nations that are going to come up against, or I should say, going to join allies with Russia. All right, so let me go from there. Let me play this one right here.
Russia is set to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in its neighboring country, Belarus. President Vladimir Putin made this announcement as per Russian media reports. This will be the first time since mid-1990s that Moscow would be stationing such arms outside its territory. The announcement comes at a time when rift with the West is growing over the Russia-Ukraine war, the war that does not seem to be ending. The Russian president said the United States has been deploying their tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of their allied countries in Europe for decades. He emphasized we are just doing the same without violating our international obligations on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Okay, you see? So the weaponry that Russia has is now going to be dispersed and disseminated throughout these other countries. And again, now I want to get this other article because it's important. Let me get this scripture. This is Jeremiah 15:14. It says, "Put yourselves in array against Babylon round about, all ye that bend the bow." All right? Shoot at her, spare no arrows, for she has sinned against the Lord. All right? Again, Russia leading the charge now. Keep that in mind. It says, all ye that bend the bow. Now let's go into this quick article over here. Okay? This is called Proliferation News. May 30th, 2023. It says, nuclear weapons for anyone who joins Belarus and Russia, Putin ally promises. Okay? So what are we reading here? The start of a battle cry, if you will. Anybody that's going to join Russia and Belarus, you're going to get nuclear weapons. Right? It says Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, a close ally of Russia President Vladimir Putin, promised nuclear weapons to any nation that joined Russia and Belarus. It's very simple. You have to join the union between Belarus and Russia, and that's it. There will be nuclear weapons for everyone, Lukashenko said in a commentary aired Sunday night in Russia State TV. I think it's possible, Lukashenko added, saying that he was expressing his own view. We need to strategically understand that we have a unique chance to unite. Okay? You see that? So again, those nations that are going to join hand in hand with Russia and Belarus are going to make up those nations that are going to put themselves in array against Babylon round about, as it states, all ye that bend the bow. What's that referring to? Bending of the bow. Thermonuclear missiles. Destruction of the missiles. All right? So this thing is far from, being over, as some people would, like to hope and think. Just because you see what's going on with Israel and Hamas, all right, this is playing in the background. Russia's gearing up. Russia's getting ready and preparing. All right. So from there, let me go here. Matter of fact, let me just jump down a little bit more on that. It says Russia moves ahead with the deployment of tactical nukes in Belarus. Russia moves ahead on Thursday, with a plan to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, whose leader said that the warheads were already on the move in the Kremlin's first deployment of such bombs outside of Russia since the 1991 fall of the Soviet Union. The U.S. State Department denounced the deployment plan, but said Washington had no intention of altering its position on strategic nuclear weapons or seen any signs of Russia was preparing to use a nuclear weapon. Right. So again, the appointed time is not yet set. All right. Or I should say, the appointed time is not here yet. All right. But these missiles are going to be used. You see. North Korea notifies neighboring Japan it plans to launch a satellite in coming days. So everybody's getting ready, man. Everybody's getting ready. Now I'm going to play this last little clip and end it with this. And this clip is, it's going to play a little bit, but it's just going to give you, hypotheticals, not from Russia's point of view, but from Esau and Babylon's point of view. All right? So let's get on this right here.
Let's say things with Russia turn into the worst case scenario. A deranged, desperate Vladimir Putin sees his regime about to collapse. In a last-ditch effort to take as many enemies with him as possible, he orders a massive launch of Russia's nuclear arsenal, targeting the West. As the silos open, hundreds or thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles, armed with nuclear warheads, streak away at speeds of 15,000 miles per hour. But where are they headed? Thankfully, this hypothetical remains very, very unlikely. Unfortunately, it's also not entirely impossible. Russia has the world's largest nuclear stockpile, with nearly 6,000 weapons and roughly 1,600 actively deployed warheads. The question of where these might strike if fired is one that experts and policymakers have worried about since the days of the Cold War. Now, with nuclear threats once rising again, it's worth looking at how such a doomsday scenario might play out. In this video, we'll take a look at the places Russia might target with a nuclear barrage, starting in the United States. Some of the first US targets for a Russian nuclear strike are the major centers of power you would expect. The Pentagon is among the most important of these, as it acts as the headquarters for the US Department of Defense. If Russia were able to damage or destroy the Pentagon, it would be an enormous blow to the command structure of the US military. It would likely not cripple the US armed forces, but would cause a major disruption and make it far more difficult for the US to organize a response. Because of the size of the nuclear blast and its fallout, a strike on the Pentagon would also likely destroy much of Washington, D.C. Some 713,000 people live in D.C., while more than 6.3 million live in the greater D.C. area. Estimates for a nuclear strike on the Pentagon indicate that close to 500,000 people could be killed instantly, with many more falling sick from radioactive fallout afterwards. The initial blast would vaporize the Pentagon itself and anything else within a half-mile radius. Damage from the strike would radiate outwards some 4 miles from the epicenter, including the area containing the US Capitol building, White House, and Supreme Court. While the nuclear fireball and the enormous shockwave following it would be deadly on their own, it is the potential for widespread radiation which would create the biggest hazard. Radiation anywhere near the blast would be intense enough to cause third-degree burns, while also causing many harmful mutations in victims' DNA, leading to cellular degeneration and cancer. Even if people in the larger blast radius managed to survive the explosion, there's a good chance they would die from the huge amount of radiation exposure. The White House is roughly 2.17 miles from the Pentagon, putting it well within the damage zone of a nuclear blast. If the president were there, they would likely be killed by the force of the shockwave, even if the White House and Capitol were not targeted independently. Thousands of US officials and workers would certainly be killed, sending the government into crisis mode. The president would declare a state of emergency and likely invoke martial law. If the president were killed, the next in the line of succession would be the vice president, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretary of State, and so on, until someone alive could be reached. Besides the institutions around Washington, D.C., the second major goal of a Russian nuclear attack would be to strike as many US missile silos as possible, in order to minimize a retaliatory strike. There is almost no chance this would be totally effective, as the US has nearly as many nuclear weapons as Russia, in addition to advanced early warning systems, nuclear submarines hidden around the world, and powerful air defense systems. But Russia would certainly try to take out as many silos as possible, especially those bases with Minuteman III ICBMs, which would mean targeting some very remote parts of the US. One of these is Malmstrom Air Force Base, located deep in the state of Montana. There are around 3,400 military personnel and 1,000 civilians working at Malmstrom, many responsible for the 150 Minuteman III nuclear missiles housed at the base. If a Russian nuclear weapon were able to strike Malmstrom, it would likely kill everyone at the base, plus nearly 15,000 people in the nearby towns of Black Eagle and Great Falls. The number of injured would be nearly double, even though the area is very sparsely populated. But high casualties would not be the goal of a strike on Malmstrom, as Russia would only be trying to cripple the ability of ICBMs to be fired from the base. The effects of a nuclear strike on the local environment would be devastating. Water flowing through the Mississippi River near the impact site would instantly vaporize, while the flow from upstream would eventually pass through the irradiated area around Malmstrom. The river would carry radioactive particles downstream, potentially all the way down its length. It would take months or years for any water drawn from nearby sources to be drinkable. In the meantime, large amounts of animals could die of radiation poisoning, even those hundreds of miles away. The ecological effect of such a shock would be felt across the country, and Malmstrom is far from the only target in a potential nuclear attack by Russia. Another key base likely to be targeted by Russia is Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. The base contains roughly another 150 Minuteman III missiles and a staff of 3,200 military personnel and 420 civilians. However, the town of Minot is also more populous, with nearly 50,000 people. There would likely be over 23,000 immediate casualties, with another 20,000 suffering from injuries and radiation sickness. Like Malmstrom, any strike on Minot AFB would also cause huge environmental damage, with radioactive fallout contaminating groundwater, soil, and air. The final ICBM silo which Russia would likely attempt to first strike on would be Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. The ICBMs there would be a harder target since they are actually spread around in silos between Nebraska, Wyoming, and Colorado. The base has roughly similar numbers of staff and missiles to Malmstrom and Minot, and casualties from a strike would exceed 25,000. Cheyenne, Wyoming would also be devastated, and anyone present would receive a high dose of radiation. In addition to the major silos, a Russian nuclear attack would also target command and control centers across the country. Many of these are similarly hidden in rural locations around the US, often in plain sight. One major target would be the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD headquarters at Peterson Air Base in Colorado. NORAD is a joint organization made up of US and Canadian service members and civilians, responsible for aerospace protection of North America. Unfortunately, Peterson Base has over 8,700 active duty personnel, 1,300 reservists, 1,900 civilian staff, 10,000 family members, and over 20,000 veterans. The base also sits just outside the city of Colorado Springs, which has a population of nearly 500,000. A nuclear strike in this area would probably kill more than 60,000 people outright, and injure or irradiate another 200,000. Contamination of the water, air, and soil would again render much of the area uninhabitable, while winds could carry it into Kansas and other neighboring states. Another major target is Offutt Air Force Base, just outside of Omaha, Nebraska. Offutt is the headquarters of the U.S. Strategic Command, or STRATCOM, responsible for strategic nuclear deterrence, global strike, and operating the Defense Department's global information grid. STRATCOM is critical to the operation of the larger U.S. military. If a nuclear warhead struck Offutt Air Force Base, it could kill more than 40,000 and injure nearly 150,000. It would also seriously degrade the U.S. ability to coordinate a military response and potentially create confusion within the command structure of the armed forces. Similarly, the nearby city of Omaha would be largely destroyed, potentially killing hundreds of thousands. The Missouri River would also be contaminated, leading to the deaths of wildlife and a drop in biodiversity. In the event that STRATCOM was hit with a nuclear strike, its command would be transferred to one of the other 10 command and control centers around the country. The new command would oversee preparations for a retaliatory nuclear strike, which could happen almost instantly, since Russia would be hard-pressed to cripple the US nuclear triad. Yet another potential target for Russian nukes would be the VLF, or Very Low Frequency Transmitter in Cutler, Maine. This station transmits one-way communications to submarines in the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet, allowing them to carry out strikes if necessary. Cutler transmits its messages at 24 kHz and only uses 1.8 megawatts of power, a relatively low data rate. It is Cutler Base which sends launch codes to US Ohio-class nuclear submarines in the Atlantic, which form the most difficult leg of the nuclear triad for any enemy to deal with. By destroying Cutler, Russia could theoretically cut off US contact with the subs and make a retaliatory strike harder. While immediate loss of life from a strike on Cutler would be under 1,000, its position on the Atlantic coast means that ocean life and coastal ecosystems would take most of the damage. There is also Cutler's counterpart in Washington, the Jim Creek Naval Radio Station, which transmits to the Pacific Fleet. It also sits in a remote area with few potential casualties, but again, air and water contamination from radiation could reach both Seattle and Vancouver, potentially making life in both cities hazardous. The blast would also create huge forest fires in Washington, which could burn for weeks on end, creating even more hazardous air conditions. Russia would also target bases on Hawaii, which sits roughly 2,000 miles from the US mainland. On the island of Oahu is another VLF transmitter, which can relay orders to the Pacific submarine fleet if the Jim Creek installation is damaged or destroyed. The Lualua transmitter unfortunately also makes Hawaii a prime target, as it provides redundancy for fleet communications. A Russian ICBM strike on Oahu would also be extremely deadly, as it is the most populated Hawaiian island, with over 1 million people at any given time. Due to its isolation and contained ecology, a nuclear strike on Oahu could make almost the entire island uninhabitable. There are also very few places for people to hide from such an attack, so anyone on the island would either die quickly or be in serious trouble. Since Hawaii also plays host to multiple US naval bases such as Pearl Harbor, there is also a good chance that the state would be hit with multiple missiles, leaving no places for easy evacuation. Every one of these is a strategic military installation, but even just nuclear strikes on these positions would kill many hundreds of thousands of Americans. The effect of a nuclear attack on multiple US cities would be far, far deadlier. If Putin truly opted for nuclear war, there is no reason to think he would do it halfway, and hitting the US's major cities would also destroy their economic capacity. In a first-strike nuclear scenario, each side would try to devastate the other beyond recovery, and that means the widespread targeting of civilians. Such an attack could easily be the deadliest in human history, far exceeding the only past uses of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Outside of Washington, D.C., New York is the most obvious civilian target. It is both the financial capital of the United States and its largest city, as well as a global symbol of American power. It goes without saying that a nuclear explosion in Manhattan would be beyond devastating. The island is only 13.4 miles long, but it is one of the most densely populated areas in the entire country. An 800-kiloton nuclear warhead would instantly kill between 1.5 and 2 million people, with another 3 to 5 million seriously injured from radiation, burns, or collapsed buildings. The 5 boroughs of New York City collectively have almost 8.5 million, and every single one would have their lives upended. Even for those who avoid the initial blast or fireball, the shockwave's 500-mile-per-hour winds could prove fatal. As researchers recently wrote in New York Magazine, it would demolish the flimsiest buildings and strip the walls and roofs off stronger structures, leaving only their naked and warped scaffolding. It would snap utility poles like toothpicks and rip through trees, fling people through the air, and turn brick, glass, wood, and metal into deadly projectiles. A blast in Times Square, combined with the fireball, would carve a crater 50 feet deep at the center of the explosion. The shockwave would reach a diameter of nearly 3.2 miles, shattering windows as far as Gramercy Park and the American Museum of Natural History. The city's medical infrastructure would strain or collapse under the burden, especially with many major hospitals destroyed. Similarly, evacuation from Manhattan and other boroughs would be extremely difficult due to the destroyed buildings, collapsed tunnels and bridges, and press of people trying to escape. Nuclear blasts also release a strong electromagnetic pulse, which would knock out vital systems across the city, including electronic communication, medical technology, and the power grid itself. This would make any emergency response vastly more difficult and lead to even greater casualties. Yet in the event of a real nuclear war, Russia wouldn't stop there. Los Angeles is another obvious target, as the country's second-largest city and a major source of American wealth and cultural power. LA is not as densely populated as New York City, with some 4 million inhabitants and sprawling, low-rise housing. But at this point, we probably don't need to tell you that a nuclear blast in downtown LA would also be apocalyptic. 500,000 to 700,000 could die instantly, with 1.5 million more injured. LA also has roughly 5.5 million cars and little public transportation. Because of this, major roads even well outside the blast zone would be almost impossible to use, as people flee from the radioactive fallout. LA's chronic drought would also be made far worse, potentially leaving millions without safe drinking water. In the middle of the country, Chicago and its nearly 3 million residents would also likely be targeted. A nuclear blast here could kill 500,000 to 600,000 instantly, and badly injure over 1 million, while a large portion of the blast would explode into Lake Michigan, with winds spreading the fallout north, south, and east. The heavy populated Great Lakes region would be at risk, and probably need to be evacuated as well. To have any chance in a nuclear war, Putin would need to go all out before the West could overwhelm Russia's limited defenses. Because of the effects of wind, even a small percentage of the nuclear weapons in Russia's arsenal could spread fallout across much of the United States, and make many areas completely uninhabitable. Being far away from the actual impact sites still might not be a guarantee of safety, especially in more densely populated parts of the country. Since 80% of Americans live east of the Mississippi River, any nuclear strike on the eastern seaboard would be especially deadly. Overall, estimates suggest that the total number killed, injured, or exposed to radiation in a full Russian nuclear attack could exceed 256 million. That's 3/4 of the population just in the United States. But an attack on the US would also leave Russia open to retaliation from other NATO countries, meaning that they too would almost certainly be targeted early in a nuclear conflict. This would mean major European military installations like Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, which coordinates NATO's air and missile defense networks. Spotters at Ramstein would be among the first to know if a country like Russia actually launched nuclear ICBMs, but due to its relative geographic proximity, there will be little time for a possible evacuation. A nuclear blast over Ramstein would kill some 30,000 people, while winds could potentially carry fallout across the continent. Assuming a retaliatory strike didn't just wipe Moscow off the map, this also makes European targets riskier for Putin in the event of a nuclear attack, since at least some fallout could make it all the way back to the Kremlin. Other military targets in Europe which might be targeted include NATO's Supreme Allied Command in Belgium, as well as other US bases in Europe, like Caserma Ederle in Italy, which hosts the US's powerful 173rd Airborne Brigade. Strategically or economically important cities in Europe are also potential targets. This includes London, the most populous city in Western Europe, with over 8.8 million people. The UK also has roughly 200 nuclear weapons of its own, which also might make it a high-risk target. Similarly to New York City, a nuclear explosion over London could instantly kill over 1 million, while total casualties from the shockwave and radiation could be over 2.3 million. London is also the capital of the UK, meaning that its government would also likely perish in the blast. As with other cities, London's vital infrastructure would also be completely devastated, making any emergency response very difficult. And coastal winds coming off the Atlantic could carry the radiation north into Scotland, and west into France, and other parts of continental Europe. Long story short, anywhere in the world, getting hit with a modern nuclear weapon would be a horrifying scenario. While this hypothetical is obviously incredibly unlikely to happen, it's also pretty obvious that if it did, there would be basically no good options. Because of the concept of mutually assured destruction, which has kept nuclear war at bay since the 1950s, governments like the US are ridiculously unprepared to deal with the consequences if it did happen. As the article in New York Magazine recently put it, more than 70 years ago, America became the first and only country to use nuclear weapons in war. Despite witnessing the immediate and enduring horror of those attacks, despite decades of technological advances in nuclear warfare, the US remains shockingly unprepared for a similar assault on its own soil. Much of the short-term response to a nuclear explosion in a city like New York would be improvised, adapted from plans meant for other kinds of disasters. Putin knows that firing even a single nuclear weapon would likely mean the end of him and possibly much of Russia, but the fact remains that nukes are out there and could theoretically be used at any time in the future. In an increasingly uncertain world, it wouldn't hurt governments around the world to step up their nuclear preparations, because the fact is, it's impossible to know the future. But what do you think? What would the targets for a Russian nuclear attack be? And just how unprepared is the world for that small possibility? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.
Alright. So that being said,
You have to reach out to somebody.
that being said, let me get rid of
Hope
that
is
shit.
here.
That being said, you know, again, this was from the eyes of Esau over here in Babylon. Now, little do they know, which they probably do know, America's going to be totally destroyed. These nuclear weapons that are going to be launched over here, they're not going to be picking and choosing certain destinations and maybe we can, you know, hit this location. This place is going to be totally annihilated. All right? So all this hopeful and wishful thinking about if they hit here and, you know, this many casualties if they hit here, that's not realistic, man. All right? There's a lot at work here. And the majority of these nations that are going to be gearing up, they're going to join in and follow suit with the ones whom they're joining alliance with. All right? So it was a little long, but it was pretty decent to listen to and to watch. But so Lord willing, we'll get back to you on another one. But until then, we gotta keep our eyes sharpened, and keep breaking these prophecies down, because time is short now. And the Lord is really starting to make things happen. All right. So with that, I'm gonna say shalom.